Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast today is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKU SCF FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, and the HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, with support from the university's Faculty of Law. I'm your host, Ajay Shamdasani. The overarching theme of today's episode is environmental, social, and governance matters writ large, better known by the acronym ESG. In our initial spotlight segment today, we'll be speaking with Dr. Ina Amesheva of ESG Book in Frankfurt on growing calls to simplify Europe's ESG rules. Following that, we'll have a chat with Janet Ledger, CEO of Commuity Business, a Hong Kong-based NGO, on how ESG can drive the goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion forward. But first, a recent article from Bloomberg stated that there's a growing chorus in Europe seeking more simplified ESG rules for the continent. To that end, a group called the Platform on Sustainable Finance is advising the European Commission to make changes to its taxonomy. The concern is that current ESG rules are complicated and of limited use. With us to discuss the matter is Dr. Ina Amesheva, Director and Head of ESG Regulatory Solutions at ESG Book in Frankfurt, Germany. In that capacity, she leads the group's regulatory solutions offering, focusing on implementation of the EU's Sustainable Finance Action Plan, including regulations such as SFDR and the EU Taxonomy, the SEC climate recommendations, as well as following major international developments in the field of sustainability regulation. ESG Book's wide range of cloud-based sustainability products and solutions are used by many of the world's leading financial organizations, which collectively manage over 120 trillion US dollars under management. Ina also has the distinction of being an HKU alumnus, having attained her PhD in law from our Faculty of Law. And with that, Ina, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So the recent article on Bloomberg that I referenced stated that the Platform for Sustainable Finance wants substantial changes to corporate reporting of sustainable business activities. Specifically, they want the EU's taxonomy regulation to be, quote, revised to make it easier for companies to decide which metrics are material to report. The regulation, which was adopted in 2020, has been characterized by some companies as being overly complicated and of limited use, end quote. What are your thoughts? I mean, is there some sense in letting companies decide what they will or won't disclose and report, or I know there's pressure from the private sector, but is this a good idea? What are your thoughts?
Sure. I think some context might be helpful for our listeners here. Essentially, this recent report from the Platform on Sustainable Finance is following up from an overarching proposal to simplify sustainability reporting across the continent, across Europe, and this is itself coming from the Omnibus Proposal regulation that was announced by Ursula von der Leyen back in November, with the idea of reducing the reporting burden for European reporting companies, cutting red tape, simplifying reporting, which actually responds to the call of the Draghi report to enhance European competitiveness overall. So you can see it's a chain reaction in a multitude of various initiatives that aim to scale back regulatory overreach that has taken place, according to some stakeholders, over the past few years with the EU Green Deal and all these reporting initiatives that we just outlined. The omnibus itself intends to combine essentially the EU taxonomy, the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and also CSDDD, which is the due diligence directive that is coming into force. So it's essentially a simplification package intended to bring these three huge regulatory instruments together under one roof to then streamline the reporting for companies. Bringing it back to your question, I think regulation can be seen in this case as a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, financial markets demand a lot of standardized, high quality, comparable sustainability data, and they were expecting that as a result of all these regulatory disclosure initiatives, the data would eventually become more widely available. But on the other hand, we also need to understand the concerns of these reporting entities that have been subject to this increasing regulatory reporting burden, with, of course, a huge cost associated with it. So I think the EU is right now trying to play a balancing role and kind of look into the interests of these stakeholder groups and try to strike a middle ground, perhaps, into what the future of sustainability reporting will look like in the coming years.
Now, it should be noted that, notwithstanding the business community's concerns, not everyone is in favor of revamping the rules. I mean, I think Client Earth and 150 some other odd civic organizations have made their opposition known. I mean, I guess there are arguments to be made on both sides, but in a world that's as economically competitive as ours, the sense is that these reforms are probably going to go through. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. So the sense is that the reforms will go through, but the extent to which bureaucracy and reporting burden will be reduced is still to be determined. There's a lot of speculation currently in the sustainability space in terms of exactly what kind of changes will go through in terms of either reducing the reporting thresholds for companies based on company size and so forth, extending the timelines, or cutting the number of reporting data points by their statistics between 25 to 35% being quoted. Or it could be a mix of all three, essentially. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there on the market, and indeed a lot of these stakeholder groups that have called on the EU authorities to stay the course and not backtrack on their level of ambition. They're completely understandable, because Europe has been one of the frontrunner continent when it comes to setting these standards. And just when the rules are starting to come into effect, they're now announcing this kind of backtracking in their position, which of course brings a lot of uncertainty to the market, which in itself is not ideal for enhancing business competitiveness. So it's definitely we are witnessing a lot of different standpoints here. Like you said, investor groups and a lot of financial markets, and even some leading companies are calling for consistently keeping these rules intact. While on the other hand, some national governments, including France and Germany, have been very vocal in terms of calling for the simplification package to actually go through. It's worth noting that France was actually one of the early adopters of, for example, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It was the first country in the EU to transpose it into its national legislation, but now it is in its own turn. It's calling on the European Commission to essentially introduce the simplification. So obviously, a lot of discussion can be had on the underlying reasons for that. We've seen a lot of political shifts both within the EU and of course across the pond with the recent US elections. And it's also not surprising that this announcement by Ursula von der Leyen came in November, just after the US election results. So it could be that it's a result of a macro political shift. And yeah, the interests of various business entities and associations will be taken into account in light of these political developments. So it's a lot of kind of rope pulling, if you wish, in terms of the ultimate outcome of what we are to expect over the next few weeks.
Certainly, these things don't exist in a vacuum, and it's affecting other things too, like the industry. The private sector would like I believe the EU's AI liability directive to be watered down as well. So, multiple things are clearly happening at the same time, and they're trying to be business friendly. But the position of the platform on sustainable finance is that these changes would, quote, reduce the reporting burden for non-financial companies by about 33% and lead to a, quote, significant simplification for financial institutions, end quote. I mean, is that an exaggeration? Are they overstating the case, or would it really make that much of a practical difference?
If we look at the specific report on the EU taxonomy simplification, the EU platform on sustainable finance does have a point. So the EU taxonomy is the classification system for economic activities that can be considered sustainable according to very detailed sets of criteria that assess various types of contributions to sustainability objectives, do no significant harm rules, and minimum social safeguards. And the text itself, the text of the regulation and the delegated acts spans thousands of pages. So the complexity is indeed a very real concern. And arguably, the taxonomy as a regulatory instrument has been over-engineered, especially in light of the quite low levels of alignment that we witness across the board. For example, ESG Book research suggests that there's roughly 12% of average turnover-based alignment with the sustainability activities named under the taxonomy. And if that is aggregated into financial institution portfolios, we have also seen recent research pointing to low single digits of overall banks and investor portfolio alignment with the taxonomy activities. So it's also quite a concern there that the taxonomy as a financial and regulatory instrument has created that complexity, but the added value that it is projected to have, it's actually under question. And another final concern is that the regulators pointed out that the taxonomy framework will be a living instrument, so ever evolving, and that is essentially seen in the fact that a lot of the activities are still not very well defined, or it's not complete. So there are various economic sectors and industries that are not yet in scope, so they're not even able to determine their own taxonomy alignment levels, even if they wanted to do so. So to my mind, calls for simplification, such as the recent EU platform on sustainable finance report, are welcome. Obviously, with a caveat that this needs to be quite carefully considered in light of the overall omnibus proposal. And a high level comment is that this level of complexity is also resulting from the fact that there are a number of regulatory silos, and in some cases, regulators are not really speaking to each other when it comes to designing these policy instruments. And then you see a lot of fragmentation on the market. So hopefully, this will be a positive overall development in terms of aligning these reporting requirements, making them decision useful, and essentially allowing these regulations to achieve the overarching objectives they were intended to do in the first place.
When it comes to corporate reporting burdens, now the platform in sustainable finance has also said that corporate reporting burdens could be eased by making some data voluntary and simplifying disclosure templates. But it strikes me that at a time when the emphasis is on greater transparency, again, by making some data voluntary, it creates a presumption in the minds of the general public that, well, you're giving us less disclosure. What are you trying to hide? Less disclosure is seen as an anathema to investor and interests and an open society. What are your thoughts?
This is indeed a very good point, and what I mentioned earlier, that was the hope of financial markets, that through these instruments like CSRD and EU Taxonomy, we would have a much improved data landscape, much greater transparency and visibility into companies' non-financial information. So that was the intention. On the other hand, if you see the practical implementation on the ground, if we come back to the complexity point, with the EU taxonomy being such an intricate framework that requires the evaluation of various very detailed thresholds, including in many instances cross references to other EU legislation and so forth. It of course involves a very high cost and resources that companies will need to invest into procuring this data. And also what I mentioned is that even after undergoing that detailed assessment, companies are disappointed to see that their overall turnover, CapEx and OpEx alignment levels are still quite low compared to what is to be expected if we're looking to focus on the green and sustainable transition. On the other hand, with CSRD, the Corporate Reporting Directive, they're currently in scope about 1,200 unique data points that would need to be subject to some kind of materiality assessment by companies. So you see the reporting burden is also significant on that front. So I think it's really important to consider the decision useful information, the financially material information. Of course, in Europe, we also have the impact of double materiality, which means that you need to consider reporting metrics that are not only relevant to your bottom line as a company, but that are also relevant to the broader environmental, societal, and internal stakeholders. So that is one of the unique concepts of the European reporting regime, but that is itself now under question with these proposed amendments to this legislation. So I think financial markets would be better served by high quality standardized data that is also clear for companies to report. And my recommendation to policymakers would be to focus on a core set of data requirements that is actually feasible for the companies to report on, and then increase the level of ambition over time, rather than starting with a very high reporting burden that is very difficult for some companies to meet in the first place. So that would be, I think, the prudent course of action that serves financial markets, but at the same time doesn't cripple companies in the real economy and essentially impose unrealistic reporting requirements that involve a lot of cost and internal capacity building and so forth.
I think the point about standardization is important because that allows for comparability across the board. Of course, not all factors are relevant to every industry, every sector. And I think earlier you pointed out that for certain industries and sectors that they're still trying to figure out their own taxonomy. That suggests to me then that the yardstick is not concrete. It's not fixed for every industry, every sector. What also comes up is the so-called green asset ratio, and as the article points out, the group also recommended changes for calculating the so-called green asset ratio, which measures banks' investments in sustainable businesses. Altering that, would that not lead to a dilution of standards, or would it lead to more precise standards, as advocates have suggested?
Well, the green asset ratio is essentially the proportion of your taxonomy aligned activities from your overall banking portfolio. And by definition, it is heavily biased towards European companies because only European companies have to report the green asset ratio, because only they are under the scope of the EU taxonomy as it currently stands. So obviously that leaves financial institutions with quite heavy or quite big data gaps in their portfolios because only very small portions of their portfolios might be exposed to European markets to begin with. So these new proposed changes by the EU platform on sustainable finance, they intend to broaden the scope of the possible estimation approaches that would be allowed to calculate green asset ratio exposures, And that is starting with, for example, including estimations for the non-European portions of the portfolio, so the companies that are not reporting in the first place. With that said, there are actually a variety of international taxonomy initiatives, like ASEAN, the UK is developing its own, Singapore, China, and so forth. So this estimation-based approach could essentially allow the integration of these international taxonomies into the green asset ratio calculation and ensure interoperability across global regimes. So, to my mind, this is a welcome measure. Once again, with the caveat that whenever there's an estimation approach integrated into any kind of data models and assessments, we need to be very clear on the precise details of the methodology being used, any assumptions being made, so that we and financial markets are able to compare apples to apples in this sense. So I believe that these proposed changes to the green asset ratio will only lead to greater data availability and a greater ability of financial markets to essentially evaluate portfolio exposures and risk, as well as opportunities related to the sustainability and green transition. But again, I think, as always, the devil is in the detail, and it will all come down to the successful implementation. Even if we have the best rules, it would really essentially boil down to whether they are able to be implemented by the intended stakeholders. So it remains to be seen. And now, following this latest report by the EU platform, the European Commission and the standard setters would have to evaluate the recommendations, probably launch a consultation on this, consulting various impacted stakeholders. So it's still to be seen whether these rules will eventually come into effect or not, or whether the European Commission would only choose to adopt some of them and not others. So it's definitely a space to watch if you're interested in evaluating sustainable sector exposures.
Well, this has been very insightful, and in the time we've got left, are there any concluding thoughts, any remaining points you'd like to make?
Sure. I would have to say that despite this recent political backlash that we were witnessing in certain regions, we also need to be mindful that there are also global companies that want to remain front runners regarding their sustainability strategy, no matter the macro environment. And this is certainly commendable. It is coming to show us that despite political and macro shifts, the demand for bottom-up sustainability credentials and essentially transitioning business models towards longer-term resilience is something that will stay. And we also know that political cycles are in their own way short-lived. So it might be that after this kind of perceived backlash, we'll have another kind of renewed level of ambition. So I would say to listeners, I would kind of advise them not to be discouraged from some of the changes that we're seeing right now, and yeah, essentially to know that sustainability is a long-term objective that a lot of people are pursuing, irrespective of other changes. So stay positive.
Ina, Amesheva, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Ajay.
And we'll be right back. Welcome back to the broadcast. International Women's Day is right around the corner on Saturday, March 8th. And in keeping with the theme of today's episode, which is ESG, we'll be speaking with our next guest about how ESG can drive forward the goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, better known by their acronym DEI. Janet Ledger is the CEO of Commuity Business, a Hong Kong-based non-governmental organization that's one of the city's most renowned and active NGOs. With over 4 decades of work experience, she's built a successful career as a senior leader in multiple fields. She came to Hong Kong to join Community Business as its chief operating officer. Janet's true talents lie in strategic leadership, organizational development, and fostering inclusive environments. She's led Community Business in its mission to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion across Asia. She works with teams to open channels of communication, develop talent, and create inclusive environments that drive organizational success. She's a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, an alumnus of the Women's Foundation Mentoring Program of Hong Kong, and a member of the 30% Club of the Hong Kong Steering Committee. And with that, Janet, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me to join.
This is truly an honor. I've heard a lot about you, so I've given a summary of your bio. You're very accomplished, but tell us the bits that perhaps maybe don't necessarily fit in.
So I was born in Brisbane in Australia, but I grew up outside of Brisbane in a place called Goodna, which to this day is still considered very much the wrong side of the tracks. So,
Oh, really? Okay.
yeah. So I come from a working class background, and I had very socially aware and responsible parents at the time. So they were very, very community minded and gave back, even though we probably didn't have a lot to give back. But that's very much shaped my journey as a leader. I left school at 17, and I did a year of art college. But then I moved to the UK when I was 18. I lived there for about 7 years and just literally had various different jobs. I've worked in bars, I worked in department stores, and I think my first proper job was a flight attendant. So it's a long way away from what I'm doing now.
Well, you're serving others though, so
that's right. Yes, still serving others. And then after a stint flying in Melbourne, I then joined Australia's largest telco, and I had a career of 25 years there. And it was actually through my role at Telstra that brought me up to Hong Kong. So that was about a decade ago. And I worked predominantly over my career in Telstra I was in Telstra operations for the bulk of that time. So heavy engineering centric, majority male environment. And that's where I sort of covered a lot of the range of disciplines that you touched on in the introduction. So the last sort of 5 or 10 years of my corporate career were sort of in the offices of COO. So the COO's office in Australia and then the international COO up here. And then in terms of my education, I think I left school at 17. Most of my professional development, therefore, has been on the job. So, I was fortunate enough to be sent on a lot of leadership programs with my employer. And I also did a bit of external study myself. So I gained my advanced diploma in project management, and then my Bachelor of Psychological Sciences, that was literally just last year. So I'm the first person in my family to have actually had a university education, which is something I feel quite proud of.
Were you, I don't want to suppose too much, but would you say that when you were coming of age, it was still an era where education, people stressed it more for boys than for
absolutely. Absolutely. So,
the expectation being that a woman would marry and
yeah. And at a young age, it's one thing I'll give my parents, there was never any pressure for me to do any of that. And that was very different to literally everybody that was around me and all of their friends. So, I'm grateful, very grateful for that. I had a working mother, out of necessity more than anything else, but most of my friends didn't. So, and I also had an aunt who never married and had sort of worked all the way through to retirement. And so there was a lot of, and even in the education system, I remember sort of battling being forced to doing things like mother care and home economics and refusing to do it.
Oh, really?
So it was, very much, there was very limited encouragement, and even having school guidance counsellors telling me I should consider secretarial college, and, and then nothing wrong with that. Perfectly great job, but I knew it wasn't what I wanted.
It seems to me that to some degree you did have your female role models, though, and maybe
Yeah, I did.
many of your contemporaries might not have been that blessed.
Yeah, and then on the other side of that as well, like my grandmother's on my mother's side was married to a merchant seaman, so he wasn't around a lot. And she came to Australia in the 1950s as an immigrant, and she set up a bakery. So she was sort of, and she sold it before I was born. But there is certainly, obviously, at that point where I get asked the question a lot, like, what do you think was different? So I think having those role models around me made a really massive difference.
So yeah, certainly I can see maybe where those seeds of entrepreneurial curiosity may have been planted.
And quite a feminist father.
Really?
But there's things that I sort of have to say to him now that I think, I say to him, you could have taught me how to do that, but because of my gender, you didn't. And he agrees. But yeah, in terms of the way he was around women, he certainly didn't put any limitations on me. I didn't feel as though I had them.
Again, I don't want to be presumptuous, but it sounds like he was pretty enlightened for his generation then.
Oh, totally.
So you made the move to Hong Kong. What brought you to our shores?
So I was on a high potential program with Telstra, and it was a leadership development program. And one of the recommendations that was made off the back of that to round out my experience was to get some M&A experience and some international work experience. So I looked around, I was sort of looking around for a role, and I actually applied for one role up here with the head of international and missed out on that. And then the COO of international got wind of the fact that I'd applied for that role. I knew him from when he was working in Australia. So he reached out to me to talk to me about what an opportunity that he had. So I was moved up to work for the COO of Telstra International, and initially in a capability development role. So they'd bought another telco, or they'd sort of bought an infrastructure business up here, and so they were merging the people, and he wanted some help, just around the sort of the people and cultural change management aspects of that. But once I got to Hong Kong, he had one of his technical leaders resign, and so I picked up managing the data centers, and then in time the product development as well. But one thing I didn't want to let go of was that sort of organizational and cultural change element of what I was doing. So I held both essentially, and I had a small team that worked with HR and the sort of DEI leaders and the like around the cultural change management side of things, and then also the operational leadership component with the sort of engineering centric teams that I was leading. And then in 2018, you can only sort of do the expat thing in the company for about 4 years. So there's a fair bit of noise about them wanting me to move home. And at that point, my husband and I really didn't want to move. So I actually asked for a redundancy and was fortunate enough to get it. And that, given the amount of tenure I'd had in the organisation, sort of put us in a situation where I could afford to go for purpose over income. And so I started looking around, and I was super fortunate in it not long after I left, because I sort of wanted to join the NGO sector, but the thing is, you've got to be able to have something that you can give back. And I saw a role for the COO at Community Business. And, in reading the job description, it was a nice fit with what I'd done in my corporate life. So I felt as though I had something that I could give back. So I started as the COO in 2019. And that was such a huge time of transformation in this city. And I held the COO role until the beginning of 2023 when I stepped into the CEO role.
Community business is well established. I guess, what was it about their mission that attracted you, and what was it like working with Shalini Matani, the founder?
So Shalini had moved on by that stage and was running the Zubin Foundation. So it was Vern Nye who hired me. So I worked for Fern Nye, who was the I think 2 CEOs ago for community business, and she sadly she retired about 7 months into my tenure because I was keen on learning from her. But I do have a bit to do with Charlene in the current role, and obviously we partner with Subin as frequently as we can. But the reason community business, I guess, given it's a not-for-profit that is all about championing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace and in the community, that was a very strong alignment with my values. It was a perfect fit, in that, I guess, it's okay for me to think, oh, I want to be in the NGO sector, but I had to have skills to offer, not just intent. So, so it was a very nice alignment with my own value system.
Let's talk more about ESG and DEI. I mean, what was it that first sparked your interest in that whole kettle of fish, broadly defined?
Yeah. So when I joined, I sort of, obviously I spent time sort of getting my head around what it was that we did, and coming from a strong operational background, and also a lot of the work that I had done in my corporate life was around ensuring we had the right measures and metrics in place. And it, the sort of work we do, it's a hard thing to necessarily measure. And community business at that point in time had work structured around a range of pillars that the organisation had landed on to articulate the impact of the work or describe the work externally in terms of the societal change that we're driving. And on reflection, when you look back at the pillars, while they were very reflective of how the organisation was founded, they weren't necessarily a great fit for how we'd evolved. So it was almost like we were creating initiatives for the sake of being able to meet a pillar or a strategic imperative rather than stepping back and going, what's the societal impact that we're trying to make? And I'm also, coming from a solid operational background in the corporate sector, I always want to look at a framework first, and rather than reinventing the wheel. So, sort of in having a bit of a look around, it made, perfect sense to me to start with an ESG framework and understand how that might align with the work that we did. So after making that decision, we obviously needed to give ourselves some education around that. And then what we did was a number of internal workshops with the team and our board to land on, essentially, 5 SDGs that fit within the ESG framework, mostly in the S and the G, to explain our work and the impact that we do. So where we landed was, it's partnership for goals, gender equality, reducing inequality, good health and well-being, and decent work and economic growth. Now, in terms of the programs that we have that fit under that, they might not fit under one. And in actual fact, in my mind, that's a good thing, because if we're running an initiative that is actually, for example, partnering with another organisation around something like gender equality and talking about mental health and the intersectional nature of that with women, then, that's a great thing. So, it's sort of that's sort of where we landed with it. And it just seemed to make logical sense to handle it that way.
To what extent can ESG be used to further and achieve the goals of DEI? Is that possible?
Yeah, well, I do think so. But I guess one of the things I probably want to say up front is that I think both terms have become buzzwords, which it then sometimes has tended to be co-opted with what...
Very loaded buzzwords at that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's become synonymous with wokeness. And, they're not they're technical definitions that form, a basis of work, so.
Right, they're terms of art that have now become, dirty words. They become verbs.
Yeah. And so sort of, environmental, social and governance, I know you know this, but it's a set of standards that socially conscious investors use to screen investments, but it has been expanded to include standards for companies to help them to be more sustainable and ethical. And then DEI, in terms of, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a concept that's used by organisations to recognise and value differences among people, make sure that we've got fair opportunities for everybody, and that I must stress it is for everybody, and foster a work environment where everybody feels welcome and respected. So, if you sort of break those factors down, there's a lot of overlap between the concepts. So if a company is sort of looking to enhance their diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, they can do that with an ESG lens. I guess a little bit like we did when we landed on the SDGs that we think align to the work that we do. And when implemented strategically, it can actually be a driver of your D&I progress. So, I think a lot of what we do in the S is in the S pillar that would align to D&I are things like workforce diversity and inclusion. So, in the social pillar of ESG, this encompasses lots of aspects of D&I. Companies are increasingly being evaluated by investors around their potential employees, governments and other regulatory bodies on their workforce diversity statistics, their pay equity, and their employee engagement scores. Similarly, human rights and labour standards. The ESG framework requires companies to address human rights and labour standards within their operations and supply chains. A lot of work that comes our way is due to supply chain and people needing to demonstrate that they're doing the right thing by their employees. And this includes, fair treatment of workers, combating forced labour and child labour, and promoting safe working conditions. So once again, these are really inherently contributed or contribute to a more equitable and inclusive society. In the S pillar or social pillar, there's an emphasis on a company's relationship with local communities that it's operating in. Diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations can be integrated into community engagement initiatives where you can target support for underserved groups and partnership with diverse-owned businesses, invest in education and workforce development programs in underrepresented communities. And of course, in the G pillar, with diversity, equity, inclusion, so governance, board diversity, is a huge part of governance around, corporate leadership and accountability. So, investors are pushing for greater diversity on corporate boards and recognise that diverse boards lead to much better decision-making and oversight. So a diverse board is much more likely to prioritise diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and hold management to account for progress. And without getting too controversial, there's a couple of boards in the last month or so that have said no to actually not, that have said no to a push to drop their D&I initiatives. So, we are seeing boards saying that they do want to continue on the path. Part of the governance is, there's some companies that are beginning to tie executive compensation to more inclusive goals, as well as incentivising their leaders to prioritise this. And then also transparency in reporting. So, ESG frameworks encourage companies to be way more transparent about their diversity, equity, and inclusion performance, which includes publishing, data on workforce demographics, pay, relevant metrics. A great example is what's happened in Australia around pay equity, where, the ASX 200 companies have been forced to do reporting on pay equity, and it's really making a difference. If you think about environmental, there's sort of indirect impacts on D&I. So while it's not directly related to D&I with an organisation, it has implications in terms of context of environmental justice. That marginalised communities often bear the brunt or disproportionate burden of environmental hazards. So where people are looking at, taking into consideration the elements of underserved communities, and that can also help inform on their environmental strategies. So to ensure that they don't disproportionately impact on those communities. So there's a lot of overlap. If the ESG is a powerful framework helping you advance your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, particularly through the social and governance pillars. And I think to me it works around the same way, that if you're actually looking at your ESG strategy. It's not a silver bullet, but the two of them work really, really nicely. And if you've got a comprehensive DE&I strategy that's multifaceted, it's going to, go beyond just simply ticking boxes on an ESG scorecard.
A follow-up question would be, well, what about the synergies between ESG and DEI? Because they're closely related and intertwined, but not necessarily the same thing. But it seems to me what you're saying is that work you do in one area, progress you make in one, can pay off in terms of the other as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a lot of shared values. So, both ESG and DE&I are rooted in values of ethical conduct, social responsibility, and much more long-term sustainability. And they also reflect a growing recognition that businesses have a responsibility to contribute beyond a more, just and equitable world, or contribute to a more just and equitable world. It enhances companies' reputation. So, when they are prioritising both ESG and DE&I, they tend to enjoy a much more enhanced reputation amongst customers, their employees, and their investors, and also other stakeholders. So, a commitment to these principles signals that the company's ethical, forward-thinking, and responsible. And there is a growing body of research that suggests that companies that are strong in both tend to outperform their peers financially.
Absolutely. It's a very useful barometer of performance and good management, good governance.
Yeah, they're better positioned to attract the right talent. Diversity leads to greater innovation. It helps you manage your risks because you've got different voices at the table, and you're less likely to have groupthink. And then you're also reflecting your consumer preferences. So that's there's only upside. The increased innovation. There's plenty of research around diverse teams being more innovative and creative. And that can unlock a lot of new ideas and solutions to quite complex business challenges. And also, I sort of touched on risk around, companies that are prioritizing both are better equipped to identify and manage risks that relate to social and environmental issues, around human rights, labour practices, climate change, social unrest. Even within the NGO that I have, the team is relatively small, but we're very diverse. And, I'm always saying, I'm not going to see all of the risks, and I want people around me who don't think, act and look like me, because we're likely to get much, much better outcomes. And, which leads into my point around attracting and retaining talent. Increasingly employees, particularly the younger generation, they want to work for companies that align with their values. They're very, very values driven. And so a commitment to both ESG and diversity, equity, and inclusion is a very powerful tool for attracting and then keeping, most importantly, retaining that talent.
Why is there such a backlash towards ESG and DEI in recent years? Like, you and I, as educated people, informed people, can have this conversation. We can back up what we say about, no, it is beneficial. It does have a payoff. But there will always be the discontents. There will always be those that are happy with the status quo. Why is there such a backlash for ESG and DEI? And in the US, the Trump administration isn't making things any better. Why is there a backlash towards ESG and DEI?
But we consume our information in such different ways, and it's so much more immediate. Look, I know my feeds and algorithms on social feed me what it thinks I want to hear. And so I think ESG and DEI have become way more politicized, particularly by the right. With conservative politicians and commentators, viewing them as woke capitalism or social engineering, and accusing them of being anti-business or anti-American. So, we've talked a lot about the reasons why that's not the case. And of course, that political polarization has led to some legislative efforts to restrict ESG or even prohibit DE&I in government contracting. But, we are living in a way more polarized society than we ever used to, which is I think it's the massive challenge because, it's you've almost got to seek out balanced reporting. There's concerns about, some of the critics that argue ESG can lead to, lower financial returns, given investment management may prioritise the social or environment over maximising profits. And they're sort of arguing, but research suggests otherwise. And I think the science and is something that's getting ignored to an extent, or the actual, sort of where are the numbers, following the numbers, like what's actually, like looking at what is actually, rather than some of the sort of spurious claims that are being put out there. So, and so I think it's about just continuing to message message in a rational way. I think some of the opposition to DEI initiatives, in terms of affirmative action or quotas, have faced a lot of legal challenges. And, I sort of, the critics and the people who practice these, say it's leading to reverse discrimination and unfair to individuals who aren't members of underrepresented groups. Now, that's unfounded, and because reverse racism is a myth. And I think it's forgotten in a lot of these arguments that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a focus on inclusion for all. And there's been a loss of storytelling in my mind about how these programs and strategies support everybody in the organisation and not just the marginalised. So that message is to me, needs to be something we've absolutely got to double down on. You can't ignore that 80% of the world, follows some kind, is faith-based. And if you look at and I know this can be quite contentious, but if you look at the principles of most people who are faith-based, faith is based on fairness and being kind to people.
And being good stewards.
And being, absolutely. So there's a hell of a lot of alignment there. But I just think it's sort of, it's been co-opted and then presented back in such a way that, the identity politics and the focus on, minorities is forgetting the fact that if done right, it's about everybody. It's sort of, and I think when you couple that with people's natural unconscious bias, if you are from a privileged background and you've never experienced any form of marginalization, you don't understand that it exists. And that's a natural human, like unconscious bias, we all have it. It's how we function cognitively. We'd bump into doorways if we didn't, if we didn't sort of have some things that are going on in our unconscious in terms of how we function. So we shouldn't demonize unconscious bias, but we do need to find ways to speak to the majority of people who are decent and fair-minded in society.
I definitely see a generational divide, that there are guys like Warren Buffett and his partner, the late Charlie Munger, who were vehemently against things like ESG and DEI, and yet increasingly when I talk to investment advisors, younger investors place a premium on ESG. Because, and to your point about, I mean, it's ESG is important in vetting investments because it's not just, it's about sustainability, but that's a wishy-washy, nebulous term. But really, what does it do? I mean, it factors in externalities. I can't help but wonder if there needs to be a certain tipping point where enough of the old guard die off that it becomes a cascade effect. Then people won't even question the importance or the value of ESG and DEI. That will be the default position. That will be the industry standard. That will be considered a bedrock position, and that those that are opposed to it will increasingly find themselves, out in the intellectual wilderness, shouting, doing their own thing, but not necessarily being part of the mainstream, because right now people with political and economic clout are opposed to it, and that's sending a signal of fear to others that I need to conform. But again, in that environment, it's great to see some companies are actually brave enough to say, no, we wish to continue with such programs.
Yeah, absolutely. And, let's not forget, though, there's cohorts of young, marginalized or white men who feel marginalized, and they have bought into, this whole I'm losing something by other people getting something. And to me, that while it's all sort of, it's quite complex, there's got to be ways to communicate and to educate without sounding patronizing, on the, because I think that's being co-opted into, they're getting sold a story around, I'm going to lose out because this person's going to get, when this person's included, I miss out. And, you're right. I guess I think that those who hold the power do see this as do see this as a threat. I think that but I do think you're right. I do think that by and large, the younger generations, do recognise that they're inheriting a world where they're for the first time going to be worse off potentially than their parents. They're very aware of, what's happening with the climate. And so they do see these frameworks and ethical businesses as a way of actually driving the right kinds of change. So yeah, change is never linear. It's never linear. And I think that's something right now we've all got to remember. This backlash, it's really multifaceted, and it's driven by this combination of political, economic, and the ideology. And it reflects a lot of concerns around financial performance, freedom of speech, and broader cultural issues. So, I do think that ESG and DEI continues to be strong from a lot of investors and businesses and policymakers. But we can't ignore that there's also significant opposition that needs to be addressed. And I kind of feel one of the things we're all reflecting on at the moment is how do we appeal to those in the middle, fair-minded people in the middle, if you sit down rationally. And I guess it's on the point of polarization. I grew up with my father was very, very much involved in local politics, and so was his best friend, but they were on opposite sides of the political agenda. So one was conservative, my dad was more on the left. To this day, they're still best friends. So, I grew up around people who could have an ideological disagreement. And I guess I watched those two men over the years become more like, my father probably a little bit more centrist and his friend a bit more centrist through listening to each other. So I do think certainly polarization and getting angry about it isn't going to help. We just need to continue to, put the message forward rationally and support that by facts and by numbers.
In the time we've got left, any concluding remarks?
No, the main thing I would say is, there's a lot of reaction at the moment, and it's easy to want to react. And we're certainly putting an opinion forward in the work that we do. But a lot of it's also about keeping calm and carrying on. It's sort of, if you react to every negative thing that's out there, it can just seem overwhelming. So it's certainly a time to pause and reflect on how are we selling the narrative? How are we educating? How are we converting people? But, I think, we're sort of very much holding our course and continuing to do the work that we do, because based off at least in my opinion, with what I've seen and what we do and the research that we do and the research that we read, it's the right thing. It's the right thing to do for business. It's the right thing to do for society, and it's the right thing to do for the individuals who are in society.
Janet Ledger, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, OJ. It's been fantastic to talk to you today.
And to our listeners, thank you again. Until next time.